put that first. And by the time you get it, it probably will be here. So we'll do equivocation first, right? This notion of equivocation, what Spivak is saying is we have to be sure in our analysis, in our theoretical rigor, that we don't fall into the problem of equivocation. You cannot construct arguments like this wherein one term is used, but there are really two senses that the term has. For her, there's a specific term where equivocation falls. There's a few terms. Subjectivity is one, representation is one. She's saying there's a lot of not really sloppy, right? You don't want to say that Deleuze and Foucault are sloppy, but there's a lot of sort of there's a lot of gross generalizations that are happening. And as philosophers, as scholars, as linguists, we have to be far more rigorous in the meaning behind the terms that we use. So she is in the first stage telling us to remember to avoid this problem of equivocation, right? So that's the first thing that we need to understand. Equivocation. So actually I'll rewrite this, and equivocation will now be one. Alright, so equivocation, probably spelled that wrong. Alright, so equivocation is the first. Second is hegemony. Alright, so hegemony. The political, institutional, ideological root of power, the status quo, right? In a previous lecture on this theories series, in this theories series, I spoke about the Du Bois' account of sort of the split, the schism in political identity. That's going to factor into this discourse, not because there is or has ever been any connection between Du Bois and Spivak made. For me, as a scholar, I've presented the material in the order that I've presented it, because I think if you've watched my, earlier in the series, my discourse on Du Bois' account of sort of the schism in political identity, where part of the political identity is constructed as a consequence of orthodox narrative history, part of the political identity is constructed as a part of the heterodox political identity and historical narrative. You can use that to factor into this more complex account. But hegemony is this idea of the orthodox, the standard historical or political narrative, right? The hegemony, when you're talking about hegemony, you're talking about the bureaucrats who have power, the decision makers, you know, the individuals who directly influence the outcome of constituents or what have you, right? So when we're thinking about hegemony, and there's many different ways to talk about hegemony, but this is YouTube, so this is as complicated and as deep as I'm going to take it. So we're talking about power, right? Discourse in power. So if we're talking about something being hegemonized, if we're talking about the structure of hegemony, what I have here, it's the status quo, roughly speaking, and I've done a video on political obstructionism, if you want a deeper understanding of that. The political, institutional, ideological root of power. All right? Now I have to change my numbers. Number 3, so that'd be 1, 2, 3. This is 3, 4. The next is actually the notion of subaltern. Next is subaltern. There's a lot of debate between post-colonial theorists, philosophers, sociologists about this idea of what subaltern means. And I'm not even 100% sure that the notion of subaltern, for me personally, can be effectively, because of the complications of the concept of subaltern, can be effectively defined. For me, to keep it simple, this idea of subaltern unfolds just like anything else does within the historical narrative and the development of people. What does that mean? For Spivak, this idea of the subaltern relates to limited or inaccessibility, right? A limited or inaccessibility to hegemonic power. Okay, what does that mean? First of all, I'm going to discuss the notion of subaltern more, because there are other post-colonial theorists who do not agree with Spivak's account of subaltern. And what you'll find out in philosophy is everybody's right. You'll have a camp of people who subscribe to Spivak's account of subaltern. You'll have a camp of people who do not subscribe to Spivak's account of subaltern. But in making, the popularity of, and the well-deserved popularity of this, I mean, this is a canonical text, right? The well-deserved popularity of this text has infused the sort of discussion of what does it really mean, what does subaltern studies really mean. Now, with respect to hegemonic power, right, just to be clear, if it's the case, and I've done a variation of this lecture in my account of Dubois' schism in political identity, right? So if we have orthodoxy, here, and we have the historical narrative that's created, right? This is not Spivak at all, but this is sort of a fusion of several ideas to try and explain this idea of subalternity, right? And then we have the individual here, right? And I am the individual who's been made to be oppressed, right? So I am a member of the oppressed class. So I'm oppressed, I'm in a cage, right? There is a sense in which, and it's undeniable, but there is a sense in which when we're talking about the subaltern, we're talking about an individual who is oppressed. To my knowledge, and again, I can't speak, it's hilarious doing an account of a public lecture on Spivak, and the paper is on her notion of subaltern. But, and trying to speak on that account, my interpretation of the text is that there is a sense in which when we're talking about the subaltern, yes, we are talking about the oppressed, right? We're talking about the oppressed class. And we know now mechanisms in which these individuals are oppressed. In all of this, Spivak would subscribe, or her, more properly said, her article is conducive to the interpretation of Kozel's account of educational inequality, or Galtung's account of structural violence, or any account wherein our Freirean account of pedagogy of the oppressed, and so on. All of that is, we're all speaking the same language, right? There is a sense in which, through this historical narrative, I am oppressed. Because it says, hey, you, black guy, you're the bad guy, right? So insofar as there's a historical narrative, and I become the bad guy, and I'm tatted up, then, yeah, okay, the tatted up black guy, he's the bad guy. Let's be scared of the tatted up black guy. Okay, that's one sense. There's another sense in which, and I'm doing a very, very general account now because you need sort of this, what I call ghetto philosophy. I do this in my lectures and people hate it, but I don't have any pride. So ghetto philosophy is the idea of really starting with just a story, really, really simple, really, really baseline concepts. Making sure that we have a solid understanding of just the structure and the organization of those base concepts, and then gradually substituting all the jargon with all the baseline concepts so that the structure's staying the same, but the words change. That's the idea. Here, it's the story that's being told, and that story is used to oppress people, right? That's part of the story. Another aspect, though, however, is that the individual, or the group of individuals who are subaltern, they do not have access, right? They do not have access to orthodoxy. There isn't any, properly speaking then, if you really want to get to, and it might be a little early to do this because I just started the lecture, but in the purest sense, right, the subaltern don't have access to a revisionist history. You should understand what revisionist history is now because I've done, I don't know, 8 or 9, 10-part series on, maybe more than that, in this series on revisionist history. Right? Actually, I will go a little deep because you should have, at this point in the lecture, an understanding based on what I've posted so far. So we know with respect to revisionist history in sort of Dubois' sense, individuals who are just, I don't want to say merely oppressed, but individuals who are oppressed can consolidate their efforts and force the status quo, force, in a sense, infuse within the historical narrative a revisionist history to account for their purpose, to account for their significance and their contributions to the overall national or political